All right, here you are, Crushing Iron Podcast. Thanks. Man, we just had an awesome guest. What do you think, Robbie?
Oh, dude, like, I'm not gonna lie, that was, no offense to anybody else who's been on the podcast, this is my favorite, easily. I mean, we could have gone for 5 hours and talked to Steve. It's, yeah,
Easily.
refreshing and knowledgeable, intelligent, just, was a blast. Just to even have a conversation with a person who is as accomplished as him, is a highlight for me.
Yeah, you really enjoyed it, and I did too.
Oh yeah,
I got on a little bit late, but you kicked off the podcast. We pulled it together, and it was a very enlightening, very entertaining conversation with a super cool guy. Here it is, Steve Magnus.
Alright guys, welcome to the Crushing Iron Podcast. Mike is out today, he's stuck in traffic. So on our next podcast, please make sure you listen because we're going to give an extremely hard time for that. He is missing out on definitely my favorite guest we've had so far. We have Steve Magnus here with us today. Introduce yourself, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, guys. It's a pleasure to come on here.
No, it's you're like the third guest we've had on it, but a lot of podcasts, when we started doing this, all they do is interview athletes, and that's kind of like the gist of every one of their shows. And what we've kind of tried to do, or at least to the best of our ability, is like really get people who have just a ton of overall knowledge. And I guess the way I would put it is kind of influencers within the sport, and I definitely feel like you fall into that category. It definitely in the running category, obviously, but I would say in general also within the endurance community. Would you say that's a true or false?
I guess it's true. You can tell me, but it's
I'll
weird.
say it's true.
It's weird to think of yourself as an influencer in anything. So, but yeah, somehow my ideas and coaching and all that has kind of stuck in the endurance world, and I'm thrilled about it. And it's interesting coming from a running background, but talking to a lot of triathlon coaches, even strength and conditioning, and all sorts of sports that I modern pentathlon never would have imagined thinking about. So it's good stuff.
Yeah, is it you? Like, I have this tree of people, so I'm not on any social media platform except for Twitter. And when I first got on it, there were like certain people that I like gravitated towards, and then kind of built, like, as a coach myself, like obviously learning is something you try to do as much of. And if you learn or take, like papers that people post or, opinions, I had like you, Stuart McMillan, Steven Seiler, the whole Altus group too, but then, Brad's writing, and then a couple other, like some coaches in the triathlon were like Joe Filial and Paul Souza. Like, you don't all have the same opinion, but I've always appreciated kind of your objectivity in the fact of, like, in a world that we live in that is always, I think people would call you old school. And I was thinking about that on my drive home from the hospital with Hayden from his procedure. I was like, I think when people say old school, they think, oh, they've just been so patient and they know what works. They don't have to deviate from whatever new school trend is going on.
Yeah, so it's interesting hearing that, because I would probably classify myself as old school too. And it's strange as a 32-year-old now. I guess I'm getting old.
You're only 32?
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus, I'm going on 37. You're like a spring chicken.
but it's strange to consider yourself in that belt. But like the more I hang out and talk to people like Stu McMillan or Vern Gambetta or any of those other guys who you talk to are also.
Well, Vern is definitely old school.
Oh, Vern is old school. I'm not at that level yet.
Yeah, well, I don't think a lot of people will realize that. I mean, I started following Vern because I grew up swimming year round, and I'm from Tennessee. And so his work in the swimming community,
Right.
especially with the University of Tennessee, is just super well renowned. But yeah, I would definitely say he's incredibly old school.
Yes, I have not reached that level. I hope not. But it's interesting because I think it's really a reaction to kind of like our modern times is we tend to go extremes, right? And there's so many like back and forth of like new fads that you either like bounce around like a ping pong ball and going crazy, or you sit back and you step back and you're like, all right, wait a minute, like what is actually going on and what actually matters? So that's that, or at least that's how I try and approach things, because information like it's all out there. And there's like tons of stuff, and it's just like sifting through it that is the difficult part.
Right. So before we hop into maybe even some good ways to kind of sift through the chaos that is performance, quote unquote, information, tell our audience, because I'm not sure, as much as I would love to think they all know who you are,
Sure.
they probably don't know who you are, where you coach. I know you coach pro runners as well. How long you've been doing it, and then I definitely want you to kind of introduce them to your book coming out with Brad in June.
Sure. Yeah. So I coach. I guess my day job is the coach at the University of Houston. I'm a head cross country coach, assistant track coach here, and coach a bunch of college kids to try and get them to run fast. But in addition to that, I coach about a dozen professional athletes. I've had, 3 or 4 who have been top 10 at marathon majors like Boston, New York, 4 or 5 who have been top 15 at world championships. So I've done some really good stuff. And then I guess my side gig is I write. And part of that is I have a new book coming out pretty soon in June, called Peak Performance, written with a co-author, Brad Stolberg. And what we've done there is actually ventured out away from the kind of isolated world of endurance or sports or performance and looked at it from a bigger picture and said, all right, like here's some lessons that we have within, the sporting community, but let's see how these compared to what like great artists or great musicians or entrepreneurs or business people, or even, academics, what the top of each field is doing. And are those things similar to, what a world championship runner might do or sprinter? So we've found some really interesting things. So hopefully other people consider it interesting.
Yeah, I'm pretty pumped to read it. When we were talking off the air before we got started, have you read the book The Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck?
Yes.
Okay, so when you started talking about Taylor Swift's drummer, that was the first thing that popped in my head. I remember that was kind of not the same direction she took in that book, but I think it was kind of the overall reaching theme was like you can take so many great patterns and habits from the people who are the best at their specific field and apply them to pretty much every part of your life. And so why does your running be any different?
Exactly. And that's kind of the theme. As I said, I was really fortunate to just go get to hang out with some people who do some really cool stuff. I mean, there's no way in the world I would ever be able to sculpt something or draw something, but, we talked to some great people who do that stuff. And the similarities are mind-blowing, and as we were talking off air, I think one of the prime examples I like to give is we talked to Matt Billingsley, who's the drummer for Taylor Swift, and he took us through his like pre-concert warm-up routine, and he's like, yeah, no, I don't drum. It's like I do some like running, some exercises, almost like a warm-up, like you'd be getting ready for a race, because I'm trying to get like my mind and my body ready to drum. And I was like, man, that's awesome. Like I never thought of a drummer and what their warm up would be. But I think the takeaway is like that, all these things, we get so isolated in our own world, and all these things kind of cross domains, and maybe there's some cool answers that allow for innovation within sport that, a drummer or artist or a business person is doing that we haven't considered yet.
Yeah, if going to the drummer, I mean that I guess you never think about it from that aspect. I always talk about it as a coach with my athletes, but like oh, the mind and the body are connected. And no matter what you're doing or what craft you are, I think that the drummer is a great example as far as like getting your whole body stimulated and ready to perform, and not just like he said, not just going out to drum. Like to piddle, in his parents' basement next door, the guy that creates a lot of racket. There's probably a distinct difference between both of those people. But that kind of brings me to the next question. Was, we talked about this before. Is like everyone look for like the quote unquote hack these days. And everybody's looking for like the epic workout or the this is the benchmark I have to hit and I can do it this weekend. And I find it fascinating that as you coach collegiate athletes, but also from what I understand, people trying to on the same kind of 4-year cycle for trying to go to the Olympic trials, do you find that those athletes have the same mentality because they know for sure it's going to be long term? Do you find them more patient and kind of process oriented, or do you have to kind of instill that into them when you get them?
It's people are people, I think, is the bottom line. Like, people think that like, oh, you're an Olympian or you're like Olympic level athlete, like you have all these foundations. And I think really good athletes might be further along the route, but they still have to like develop and coalesce, and you almost have to bring it out of them, these ideas and concepts. So I've had some really, really good world-class athletes, top 15 in the world, who would be scared to death to run some races, right? And you'd sit there and be like, you've run everything.
Some of your like pro level athletes, and I think this is something that I think amateurs only think about them of feeling, is like actually scared to race. Like, I mean, is that common? Is it uncommon? And how often do you see it?
No, I think it occurs at every single level, and I think that's one of the mistakes that people think, is they think like, oh my gosh, like something's wrong with me, like I have anxiety, I'm scared to race, like I'm have this fear of failure. And what you see is it occurs at every single level, from like I've coached from high school on up to Olympians, and at every level there's some athlete who experiences that. So I think the mind is this thing that it's almost like this taboo subject where it's like, oh gosh, like something must be wrong with me because I have anxiety over this or that. And the reality is like it's just human to have that. And
Right.
the better athletes just figure out how to cope with it better. It's not that they're magic or special, they've just figured out how to cope with it. And I think that is the answer. It's like you shouldn't like fret and get more anxiety because you're anxious. You should say, all right, this is normal. Like, let's figure out how to cope with it.
Yeah.
Or do you find that they can even like just totally deny that they're actually scared of it when it's actually normal? Like this isn't the same, but my wife was asking me in the waiting room, she was like, are you okay? And I was like, no, I'm not okay. I'm nervous. Like I'm very anxious. And I think I've raced before too. I'm like, are you ready to go? I'm like, oh yeah, no big deal. And inside I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Do you find that there's like you said, like a certain kind of acceptance of that fear that you can actually channel to allow you to race better?
Yeah, I think acceptance is the right word. Not to get too sciencey on you guys, but one of the studies I love to tell my athletes, especially my college kids, is they hooked a bunch of normal people and then a bunch of Buddhist monks up to like an fMRI machine so they could see their like brains and what was going on. And then they essentially shocked both groups, like applied a shock to the monks and the normal people that like was really super painful. And in the normal people, you saw this big jump in the brain area related to like pain, but then you saw a big jump in the brain area related to emotion of that pain. Okay. In the monks, you saw a big jump in the area related to just the feeling, sensation of the pain, but there was no jump in that emotion of the pain, right? And I think I think that's the message I send is it's like, look, everyone feels the same amount. It's okay to feel it. You just got to accept it. And if you accept it, like, then you don't have that huge emotional reaction, because the pain isn't the problem. The anxiety isn't the problem. It's that emotional freak out that is the problem.
Yeah, so it's more the energy you put into the fear than it is the actual fear.
Exactly.
So monks would be pretty legit athletes if we could ever get them to do anything.
Yeah, if they were motivated to do it, I don't think they have the egos to do it.
Yeah, I was just about to say, unless it's like climbing Mount Kilimanjaro on one breath, I don't think that they would be that motivated.
Now, on that same topic there, Steve, that's kind of where you come from most of the time with everything, right? I mean, is that sort of where you're going regarding, athletes and getting their mindset in the right place? Is that, I mean, obviously there's other things, but I mean, I know that's a huge part of your game plan, right?
Yeah, so much of it is we were talking offline a little bit about the book Mindset by Dweck and some other stuff, but I think the mindset and the mental aspect is so big as part of the key. I think as coaches, as athletes, we obsess over the physical part, which is great. But, I've seen athletes who are perfectly in physical condition in the best shape of their life, but it never translates over to competition day. And I think what the mind does in setting the mind right is it allows you to transfer all of your potential to the competition. And that's at any level of performance, that's the key. Because like getting people relatively fit, it's not rocket science, guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you say competition, do you mean the literal competition or the competition in the event sense with yourself?
I think it depends on how you frame it. I think I think a lot of people see competition as like versus someone else, and other people see competition almost from a process-orientated approach where it's like, all right, I'm competing against the best version of myself, and I just want to get the best out of myself. And I think, again, that kind of parlays into how people feel anxiety and stress and all that stuff. Are you competing against, 500 other people in a road race, or are you just competing against yourself and trying to get the best out of you?
Mm-hmm.
You said something that I thought was that it should hit home, and hopefully does with all of our listeners. And I'm going to pick on Mike here just for a second, but that it's not rocket science. Yet we try like so hard to overcomplicate everything. And whether it's like find a different method, or it's got to be quality over quantity, or it's got to be quantity over quality, or it's all high intensity or no high intensity, or it's this, whatever the trend is, or finding something that's different when that just like more than likely the same boring, like we talked about before, stopwatch, hard work, and getting to know yourself is probably the overall best method. What does you feel like is, in your experience, like our just general over obsession with trying to overcomplicate things?
How is that picking on me, first of all?
Well, because I mean, you like to find a short-term fix that's not necessarily. I mean, you consider rollerblading cross training.
Well, go ahead, Steve.
I don't want Steve to go in on you on that one.
Rollerblade is cross-training. Okay.
Yeah. For cycling.
Yeah, moving on.
I think to answer your question there, I think it's human nature, right? Like when we enjoy something, when we're trying to get the most out of something, when we're coaches trying to get the most out of our athletes, or athletes trying to get the most out of ourselves, like we become almost like OCD obsessed over like, okay, like how do I get better? How do I do this? And whenever you get like that obsessed mode, you just go crazy into the weeds and into the details. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't at some point. Like at some point, it's really good to just do a deep dive and figure stuff out. But at other points, I think it's easy to get lost, and we're arguing over like the nuance of, should I do a 5 mile tempo at 5 minute pace or at 5:05 pace, and then in the end, it's like, all right, are those 5 seconds a mile really gonna matter? Like, does it make that much of a difference where we have to be that precise? And I think that if you step back and you realize that, like, we don't have the knowledge or the ability to measure that it really matters that much. So I think it's about being able to, like, zoom in when we need to, but also harnessing that ability and being able to zoom out and be like, all right, what actually matters?
Hey, on that, I just listened to your podcast on tempo the other night, and I wanted to ask you, because it occurred to me when you're saying, I found it really interesting, the stuff you guys were saying about, like, how you break it up into a little bit longer, just kind of like what you're just saying there. Does the 5:05 matter, or does it matter if you go, a lot of times just the runner will stop or start slowing down before the actual tempo is over and things like that. So how do you think Ironman triathlete training should even do tempo run? I mean, not really. I know maybe they should, but I mean, do you have like a theory on something like that regarding, in general, maybe a sort of like you were saying, the Dunkin' Donut kind of philosophy of Ironman training for marathon running?
Yeah, I think that's a tough thing to look at. But if you look at the demands of the Ironman, I mean, it's mostly about fuel and surviving that long. And I think if you look at, your traditional tempo running, it works great for running fast. But I'm not sure if you need it as much for running a marathon after swimming and biking all that way. What I would say is that you probably you utilize it, but I'd say it's probably not as big of a deal as if you were just training out for a half marathon or even a marathoner like that. I think it's just like a weapon in your arsenal, but I think it's kind of a, one that you don't pull out all the time.
Okay.
Is it, and because you coach everything from, track to cross country and to also, marathoners, how much of a difference, and maybe there isn't, is the training of a durability and making just like you kind of referenced to, I think, like a durable, resilient athlete from an athlete that maybe is just running 400, 800s or the mile to the ones you have that are trying to compete at, maybe Boston in a few weeks, about how much of a difference or if there is one in how their body types need to be structured.
There is a big difference. And I think that's what you have to learn from when you extend out to the triathlon and like Ironmans and stuff, is that durability becomes a bigger and bigger issue. And if I'm looking at, for example, durability to run the Boston Marathon versus durability to run a flat, fast marathon at Chicago, it's completely different. And you have to train for those things. So even if you look at marathon to marathon, it's different. But if we looked at the track, like a middle distance runner still has to have durability, but that's durability to handle running in, spikes on a track that'll probably beat up their calves versus durability to run in a marathon that's going to trash the quads because, like Boston, you go up and you go down a whole heck of a lot and all that stuff. So you have to prepare the body for the demands it's going to encounter. And I think a lot of times people overlook that aspect of most likely muscular durability. So, yeah, I think it's something you have to take into account.
Yeah, that's something that I've just now recently, I guess I've always been, and I've worked with Mike for like the last 4 or 5 years, but I've always been a very huge fan of, like you said, like Ironman athletes need to be durable and resilient. But I've kind of hung up my shoes in the triathlon world this year, and I'm actually doing the Leadville 100 in August. And, the more I've kind of researched and like done my homework is how much eccentric and concentric training I have to do to mimic the demands of the course. Like the other week I found myself doing like 10-second squats, like lowering myself for 10 seconds, like stuff to, kind of prepare myself for the damage that my body's going to get in. My body's going to have to be able to absorb when I'm running downhill. and I had never thought about even just the small stuff, like you said, between a marathon like Chicago or a marathon like Boston.
Yeah, it matters, and I think that's it matters even more if you go out to Leadville, right? The bigger
Right. Yeah.
the bigger the extreme, the more demands you're placing your body on, the better you have to be trained for it specifically. So especially that eccentric demand of running downhills, it can beat you up really fast. And what people forget is like the more damage you accumulate on the run, like the less efficient you're going to be. And when it comes to the last third quarter of the race, like it's going to be a long road if you've got a lot of damage in your muscles already.
Yep. Awesome. Feeling pretty good about it. Sweet. Yeah.
I'll be right there with you.
Yeah, that's right. You are pacing me. That's best for sure. Do you find there's a huge difference in coaching men versus women in their mentality?
Oh man, that's a get me in trouble question.
Hey, I can start because there's a huge difference in the ones that I coach. I find women actually much easier to coach than men. But that's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, no.
That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to eat my Kit Kat now. You can go to the next.
I will, as a single male, I can make this and not get in trouble. But no, I think there is a difference, and I think it's foolish to think like, I know equality's big and all that stuff, but like, just like there's difference between people, there are trends towards differences between genders, and even if we were to get super scientific and look at like testosterone levels, right? So men are obviously going to recover differently because they have different hormonal profiles than women. So that means, all right, from a physical standpoint, great. But it also means, like, from a emotional and psychological standpoint, is that there's trends in almost motivation and also, psychological framework. So there was a good book named Top Dog, which was written by Ashley Merriman and Poe Bronson, I believe. And in that book, they had a small section where they went over some of the research of how women function in teams and groups versus men. And it was really interesting because women tend to function best in what they call dyads, so groups of two. Because if there were too many, then women are much more likely to fall prey to comparison, and they do tend to do a little bit worse when comparison is the big thing, when they feel like they're getting judged. And men, on the other hand, tend to raise their game a little bit when they get into, feeling judged and being compared to a big group. So, again, making high generalities here, but there's big differences between men and women, and if you're not paying attention to them as coaches, then you're gonna fail.
So that makes your job pretty difficult, I would imagine, since you have two. That's not a requirement, but I'm pretty sure that's just how it's structured.
Yeah.
At Houston, is you can't say, oh, I'm going to split you people up into twos because
exactly.
that's what's best.
It's funny. I think I tweeted this out once, but if you watch my college kids, and let's say they're all doing the same interval workout on the track, like mile repeats, right? And we have the women's team and the men's team doing them at the same time. The men's team will be like all in a line, like on the track, right? And the women's team will be like 4 or 5 wide out into like lane 3 or 4. And that's just like how they all run. And like just seeing that picture like gives me a clue on like the differences in approaches to competitiveness, maybe not even competitiveness, but like their comfort level of what they're doing. And I think, as a coach, I have to be really careful of what I say and how I motivate at a practice when, both groups are there, because, one thing might work for one group, but it might fail miserably for the other. So it's a bit of a headache, but, we figure it out.
Is that it? Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine doing that in general, but when it comes to, like a balancing act with your athletes, because like you said, there's that, for the women, they may consider being more judged because the emotional side of the sport, I think, and we touched on this earlier, is something that goes, very much overlooked. I coach individual athletes, but for somebody like yourself who coaches multiple ones, would you say that balancing the emotional, mental aspect is harder than managing the physical performance aspect of an entire group or team?
For sure, 100%. Because the other thing that research has shown is like motivation and like emotions are contagious, just like a disease. Like if people are headed in the right direction, that's how teams get like synergy. If a couple people are off, like it'll just spread. And it's not like they're intentionally trying to sabotage something. It's just emotions spread, and that's what happens. So like managing that, especially post race where you have, if you have 7 people running a cross country meet, 3 might run well, 2 might be okay, and a couple might think the world is going to end because they ran poorly. And how do you manage that post-race and get everybody back to square one where everyone feels okay and ready to conquer the next thing? I think it's the most overlooked part of coaching, whether you're coaching individuals or a team.
That is phenomenal. That's just so interesting to me as far as a team sport goes, because I've always known and sensed that, I've always kind of called it culture or whatever, but as you're talking about how can the coach get everyone on the same page, and then that momentum is a legitimate thing, right? I mean, I don't know what it is or how to even explain it, but it's probably stuff that, happens in the locker room or on the bus or whatever, and that just sort of reinforcement of getting people's moods in the right place and getting them in the same direction. I mean, that's got to be huge in your world, man.
Oh yeah, it's huge, and that's the thing that again people kind of underestimate it. And I'm a closet or a self-professed science nerd, I guess, not a closet science nerd.
Yeah, you're not a closet science,
but I'm out there science all day. But they've tracked things like hormones, like testosterone, cortisol, oxytocin, all these things with teams, and like the message being sent, whether it's positive or negative, and like all the hormones change, based on like the reaction from the coach, based on the reaction from the teammates. For example, if I go give a debrief post race and I start yelling at my athletes, most of the time testosterone plummets, stress hormone cortisol increases, and the next match we're in trouble and performance will decrease. So it's one of those things where it's not only like psychological, but it's deep down like hormonal that actually matters.
Well, yeah, how do you know that? I mean, I obviously it, but I mean, did you like track that? Obviously,
so there's been several researchers who have tracked it. Yeah,
okay.
One of my good friends who used to work for U.S. Olympic field hockey team used to take like saliva samples where he'd like have athletes essentially like spit in a tube, and then you could get like testosterone and cortisol levels from that. I myself, like I've done. Again, I'm a science nerd, guys. I have all sorts of gadgets. So I used to have this thing that measures like skin conductance, which is what is used for like lie detectors. And it's great because you can almost get like, it's almost like emotional reactivity to things. And you could see it like if you said the wrong thing pre-race, like huge spike in like emotional reactivity, which tells you like stress hormones are going crazy and stuff like that. So
wow.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm sorry, Robbie, man.
No, go ahead.
I guess we're both just like endless questions. And you said pre-race, and that just triggered something in my head that I've always been curious about. Whenever Robbie first started coaching me back in the day, it's my first Ironman race. I was extremely nervous the couple days leading into it. And then I distinctly remember the morning of the race when I was standing in that swim line getting ready to go in the water. I have, had this overwash of calm going on. And I've always wondered how in the world, because I was so nervous about that race and that swim all the way up to that point. And that morning, I was just in complete peace with the whole day. Do you have any theories on that, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so it's I'll give you a theory. I can always make up a theory for everything.
Yeah, I'm surprised you're single, Steve, because usually as a married man, I can pretty much come up with a theory too for pretty much everything.
maybe that's my problem sometimes. Maybe that's what's gotten me in trouble. So we have a bunch of, like, everyone thinks like stress response is the same, right? It's like, oh, it's like fight or flight, right? But we actually, our body has like probably 4 or 5 different stress responses. So it's not only fight or flight, but there's also one called like tend and befriend. There's a pause and reflect. And what happens is sometimes like your typical standard like anxiety is like just kind of that fight or flight response, but sometimes based on like the meaning of the competition, the closeness of it, how you accept it almost mentally, as your body will just kind of shift into another stress response, right? And although you're still preparing for battle, what happens is like different hormones, like the almost like hormonal combination changes just enough to like put you in this like calm but ready state versus this like anxious versus ready state.
Huh.
So it's kind of it's. Would you say it's like a survival technique that our bodies have just kind of like evolutionized, like it's both mental and physical?
Exactly, it's all survival. And think about it like this: like, so if you're around the African jungle way back, thousands of years ago, if one stress response, like a flight stress response, doesn't work, then your body's not going to go like, yep, shit, we're screwed. Like, you're going to get eaten. Like, it's going to say, all right, like putting this dude in a panic didn't work. Like, let's maybe try and like keep him really calm and maybe he'll think of something, right? So it's all evolutionary, like, trying to survive. That's all it is.
I've never thought of it that way, but it definitely makes sense as far as like using it as a survival mechanism. What is, and you could probably list a million, as you've kind of grown and evolved as a coach, and obviously you're still learning as an athlete. Before you actually got into coaching, what was the best advice you ever got from one of your coaches?
Oh man, that's a good one. I my high school coach, he always said 2 things that I liked. He said, you can only do two things well at a time, and by being on this team, you're choosing running, and by being in school, you're choosing school. So nothing else in life can happen. But I not that
single.
That is a fact, but I liked it. I was like, okay, like, yeah, I can only do that. Gives me justification just to run, and then if I don't care about school, I'll just say, well, Mom, Dad, I chose running, so and a social life. So sorry, school doesn't fit. But that was a big one. And then I think after failing, like, whenever I'd have a bad race, he'd come over and be like, you know what? You did everything you can. I just haven't figured out how to put you in the right place, so I'm going to go back to the drawing board, and we're going to figure out how to get you in the right place. And I always appreciated that, because he didn't come over and be like, Steve, what the hell was that? Like, why did you run so slow? And I think it's easy as a coach to blame your athletes for not trying or not executing the way it is, but if your athlete doesn't execute the way it is, then as a coach, like, even if they screwed up, it's your job to figure out, all right, why did they screw up, and did I not put them in place to do so? And I think that was a very valuable lesson.
Yeah, I always like to use the phrase "we."
Yep.
We need to figure it out next time, or we need to get back to the drawing board, because it is such a, it's not just a coach athlete. Arrangement. It's really a relationship. And And, I always say like, oh, I haven't had a bad race, and I'm sure you have this too. You have to, where athletes probably apologize to you as their coach.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't break, 4 minutes in the mile. And you're like, really? Like, are you serious right now? And you're like, why are you complaining to me? I'm the one that should feel bad because, we're a team and I'm kind of the captain of the ship and you're the vessel and it's a we thing. And I think a lot of people underestimate that. And I think it's one of the more underestimated aspects of that, from a positive one, of having a coach is in a sport like running, where it can seem so isolating. And same with triathlon, where it's not, unless you're at the collegiate ranks, it's or in like a squad, it's very much a lonely and can be isolating sport. And the only person to blame is yourself. And having a coach to kind of almost help you with that acceptance or take the load off and make it a more of a we thing, I think is probably one of the more underestimated aspects of having a coach in those sports.
Agree 100%. I think that it takes the weight off your shoulders, and I think that's, as you said, highly underestimated, because like if you screw up and all you have is yourself, then you can go into this like cycle of horrible thoughts and going into a dark place, because like you can't be objective on yourself. Whereas if you have a partnership, a relationship with a coach, where you guys can kind of go to battle together, it's a heck of a lot easier.
I have another quick science question, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Rollerblading is not cross training. He already answered.
You know why it is because I enjoy it.
Yes, that's what I thought.
There you go.
I can do it. Where I do it is a real private area as well. So it's nice to.
I took a trip last summer to Europe, and where was I? I was in Switzerland in like some small tiny town, and I swear it was like being in the 90s. Like everyone was rollerblading. I've never seen so many rollerbladers in my life. And
yes, it's coming.
And I was like, man, it might be coming back.
Yeah, maybe there's like
fanny packs.
Fanny packs, and there's an Ace of Base concert probably about to go down.
What goes around comes around.
All right, sorry, Mike.
No, that's okay. It's quick. The real question is, I've always wondered why, oftentimes, when I feel at my worst, or I feel like it's going to be an awful workout, it sort of ends up being the best workout for me. Is that like a common thing? Or am I just, in my own world with that?
Yeah, you're just crazy. No, I'm just kidding. It's funny.
You.
It's funny you say that, because one of the pros I coach, Neely Spence Gracie, who was, 8th at the New York City Marathon last time, is about 2 weeks ago, she texted me and she said, whenever I feel horrible going into a race, I run really well. Like whenever I feel horrible warming up, I feel really well, or I run really well. And it's like backwards, because everyone thinks like, oh, if I feel great, I'm going to race great. And a lot of times that doesn't work. And I think the reason for that is when you look at fatigue and effort during racing, like part of how we judge or part of what affects how well we do in a race and whether we push or back down or speed up or slow down is psychologically, like even subconsciously, we compare how we expect to feel versus how we actually feel. So if we get to halfway and we're like, our effort is, pretty hard, but we expected it to be extremely hard, then all of a sudden we get this like almost boost where like, hey, this is hard, but it's not as hard as I expected, so I can keep going or push a little harder, run a little faster. And I think what happens is pre-race or pre-workout, if you feel bad, all of a sudden like you just expect, you're like, oh my God, this race is going to be really difficult. So when you get to a quarter or halfway and it's not as difficult as you thought it was, you almost get this boost of like, okay, this isn't that bad. Like I feel pretty good now. Like, oh my gosh, I'm having a good race. So it's almost counterintuitive, but sometimes like expecting it to hurt really bad because you don't feel good helps your race.
Makes sense.
It's another kind of level of, you said, like just overall acceptance. Like you accept it's going to be painful.
Exactly.
And it's the perfect segue to my last topic, but it's what you just said reminds me like almost to a T of what I referenced 2 podcasts ago. I did like a whole 90-day training distribution of my running and like what zones I was in, everything else. And I did like a 5K just to see how much time I had improved. And I decided to run it blind. Like no, which is hard for me. Like I'll admit, like I'm trying to like wean myself off of looking at my Garmin and because the fact of the matter is I run faster without it.
Right.
And so I was doing this 5K and I thought like based on my training, based on how I felt that day, I can probably maybe manage like mid 620s. And I was like, you know what? After some conversation with my wife about this not important topic, she was like, don't listen to music, don't look at your watch, just run. And I ended up averaging like 6:14, 6:15s.
Wow.
And which was a drop down from like 6:45s from what I had done like 10 weeks before.
Wow.
But as I was telling on the previous podcast, if I had seen anything below 6:20, I would have slowed down.
Exactly.
But yeah, because I was like, I can't do this. Like I've mentally convinced myself that I put myself in this mid 620s box, so therefore I am this, and anything outside of that is uncomfortable and I can't. Versus listening to my body, which I'm trying to do just a much better job at. And I infinitely run faster and feel fresher every time I do. And I just want to get your take on like the old. That, you know, I know they have their purpose, but from what I'm kind of getting for me now, it's more to like slow me down than it is anything else. But just like the importance of just knowing your body and the feel of it and how important that is.
Yeah, you know, it's crucial. I think that, you know, understanding and almost having like the self-awareness to experience what it's like to run at different paces and having that body awareness sense it's a skill that has to be developed. And I think people almost take it for granted, like, oh, I run all the time, I know, I have a sense, but it's a skill. And to develop that skill, you have to get rid of the Garmins and stuff. And sometimes, like, the only feedback you have is that internal sensation of effort. And I think your example is a great one in the fact that a lot of times what happens is our watches hold us back because we find and label and categorize ourselves and say, you know what, like 620 or 640 pace is hard for me, so therefore if I see anything faster, like I should be running hard. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen people at races and they go through the first mile, they look at their watch and they're almost like, oh gosh, like I'm too fast, and they panic and slow down. And you're just thinking like, you know, 10 seconds earlier you were probably thinking like, oh, I'm feeling good, I'm going through the mile, I'm feeling good, like. And now you're thinking like, oh gosh, I'm too fast, like I have to slow down. And what the question I always ask is, what would have happened if you didn't see that and you just kept rolling? Maybe this is the day that you PR'd by, you know, 30 seconds in the 5K or, you know, a minute in the 10K or whatever, but you don't give yourself that opportunity if you like became a slave to your watch and just like let yourself go. Because, you know, we've all experienced it. Some days we just feel amazing and, you know, well, 6-minute pace might have felt hard before, now it feels super easy. So those are the days you should, you know, enjoy and not freak out because, oh, this is faster than I'm, you know, supposed to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a theory. I mean, within reason, I think it's easier to run faster on some, you know. Not super fast.
Yeah,
you know
I think there is, because I think what happens is if you run a little bit, it's almost like, have you guys ever been to Germany and driven on like the Autobahn where you can go however fast you want to go?
I have not.
You have not. So there's no speed limit over there, and over here when I'm driving on the freeway, like, you know, I'm driving 65, 70 miles an hour and like, you know, you sometimes like zone out and all that stuff. And and you zone back in and you're like, oh gosh, like how in the world did I end up 15 miles down the road? Like I wasn't even paying attention, but I just got here. Over there, when you have no speed limit and you're going like 90 miles an hour, you notice you are focused the whole time, right? And I think the same kind of attention thing happens when you run sometimes, is if you're running like moderately fast or like, easy, like you zone out sometimes, and sometimes it feels kind of hard because you're zoned out a little bit. But when you run a little bit faster, like all of a sudden you bring attention to it and you are like in the moment and clicking off and aware of what you're doing. So sometimes I think it does actually feel easier to run fast.
You nailed it, Mike. It's mindfulness.
Yeah,
I think being in the moment and where time actually may fly. Who knows?
Exactly.
I only had one more question, Mike. I wanted to get your prediction, Steve, on do you think anybody's actually going to go sub 2 in this Nike sub 2 project?
Oh man,
I say no. Even if they cheat with spring shoes, I say no.
I don't think so. I think, unless these shoes work incredibly well, which I don't think they can shave that much time off. And I will say one of the guys who did the research is a researcher at the University of Houston, a good guy. I'm supposed to have coffee with him yet, so I won't trash him yet. But I can't see it. The best we've done is 202.50, whatever, and I just think it's too big of a jump. People don't make. Let me rephrase that.
It's a team.
Yes, athletes at that level don't make that kind of jump, even if they're drafting and have special shoes and all that stuff. We'll see sub 2 eventually, but it's not coming this year.
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of dropping time in a marathon versus dropping time in a 40.
Exactly.
At that level, it's just insane. It's I don't think it'll happen either, but it's been interesting. I follow I think it's Ross Tucker and Alex Hutchinson.
Yes.
And to follow their it's quite good entertainment actually for Twitter. You don't see many good conversations like that between the springs and the shoes, but yeah, I can't. First off, as a runner and as someone who considers themselves remotely athletic, sub 2 just blows my mind. Yeah. That somebody that an individual would actually be able to physiologically and clean, actually be able to do that is just blows my mind.
I'm with you 100%. I mean, I remember watching Ryan Hall run a half marathon where when he set the American record in the half marathon in his heyday, ran 59:43, so just snuck under 1 hour, and I thought it was beyond amazing. So to see someone do that twice would blow my mind.
Yeah. Mike, What else you got? Anything else? I mean, I could go on for hours, but
well, that's the problem, right?
Yeah, I know.
We could go forever. Let's just go out with this one. I was just curious about who's your running idol? Is it Steve Prefontaine, or do you think you could have coached that kind of guy?
Oh man, I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, my running idol. Gosh, when I was growing up, I just was drawn to Emil Zatopek because the dude was nuts, man. Like he'd run 6,400s, and as a high school kid, you're like, I can't run 10 of these things, and then he did stuff like he was like, all right, I need some strength work, so I'm gonna carry my wife on my back while I run.
Yes, I love it.
And Sounds like Mike.
Yeah, there you go. And my favorite was, I think his wife wanted him to do the laundry, which back in the 40s, 50s was difficult. So he just put some soap in the bathtub and all his clothes, and then ran in place in the bathtub to do the laundry for an hour. And that kind of crazy, maybe this is my problem, but that kind of crazy resonated with teenage me. So
man, he honestly, Steve, he sounds like he may have considered rollerblading cross training.
Yeah, I bet he would have. If they had rollerblades, man, he would have been all about it.
But the wheels would have been steel or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Man, do you have any runners doing Boston here in a few weeks, Steve?
I actually don't. So I had 2 last year who did Boston, but this year none. So should be fun though. I always love watching that marathon.
No kidding. When does cross country track season end?
Oh well, never. Never.
Yeah.
Never. Just keeps going. So we'll life of a coach. Always
That's it.
season.
Man, well, I've had a blast. I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule to sit down and chat with us, and maybe we can do it again after the book comes out too, and I'm looking forward to reading it, and again, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today.
No problem, guys. It's been a pleasure.